Hello everyone and welcome to this new video. As I anticipated to you last time, today I am going to analyze the figure of Pavlov, of Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist who in 1904 also won the Nobel Prize in medicine and who, with his experiments, then laid the foundation for the birth of behaviorism and all the experiments and studies that Watson later did. Pavlov was a physician and a physiologist, as I mentioned earlier, and he was busy in his laboratory going to try to understand how digestion worked in some animals, especially how the salivary glands worked. For this purpose he had taken dogs as guinea pigs and was using instruments precisely to collect the salivary secretion of these animals and measure the amount. While doing these experiments, Pavlov noticed, more or less by chance, that the animals salivated not only at the time they were subjected to the vision of food, but also when the attendant who was in charge of bringing them food appeared. At this point, Pavlov had an intuizione, as they say in psychology. He had an insight. That is, he thought that the association of this salivation with the fact that the animal salivated at the sight of the orderly was not entirely coincidental, and so he voluntarily decided to associate the arrival of food with a fixed stimulus, that is, the ringing of a bell. What did Pavlov notice? That after a number of days these dogs would begin to salivate both if the food arrived and if the food did not arrive. Simply, the sound of the bell was enough to activate this salivation mechanism in them. Another thing Pavlov noticed was that this salivation continued even if this association between the sound stimulus and the arrival of food was interrupted. That is, if the bell rang but the food did not arrive even in the following days. Until then, after a certain point, it would die out. But then it would start again right away the moment the bell sound was reassociated with the arrival of food. That is, the moment this association was restored. At this point, to shed light on this experiment and to give correct names to these stimuli, Pavlov decided to call the food unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation that resulted from the sight of this food was called the unconditioned response. What then is this unconditioned stimulus? It is nothing but a stimulus that produces a certain response more or less automatically, thus by innate or biological mechanisms of the animal itself. Whereas unconditioned response can be defined as the evoked response provoked by the unconditioned stimulus. So this whole first phase of unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, Pavlov illustrates to us that it happens automatically. That is, the animal salivates precisely at the sight of the stimulus. At this point, however, Pavlov makes a necessary distinction between the unconditioned stimulus that we have just seen and the conditioned stimulus, which on the other hand is the famous ringing of the bell. The conditioned stimulus, thus precisely the sound of the bell, is nothing but a stimulus capable of evoking a response only if it is associated with the stimulus that naturally evokes this response, that is, food. Obviously, the animal subjected to this conditioned stimulus will give a conditioned response, and this conditioned response is nothing but a response to the conditioned stimulus, basically learned by the subject by this mechanism of association. Actually, Pavlov then, pulling the sums of all this study, all these experiments that he did, came to think that any stimulus could become a conditioned stimulus. For example, the sound of a doorbell was not necessarily necessary, but you could clap your hands, or the sound of a musical instrument. The important thing was always to associate it with the unconditioned stimulus. These experiments lay the foundation for the theory of classical conditioning, which is a basic form of learning where each subject, by virtue of this association mechanism, acquires behaviors that he or she had not previously made his or her own, that he or she had not previously exhibited. What happens, however, when one associates this conditioned stimulus with the initial stimulus and then stops associating them? That is, for a long time you no longer associate with the conditioned stimulus. Pavlov noted during his experiments that after a period of separation of these two stimuli, the learned response tends to disappear, and scholars then called this phenomenon extinction. Later, Watson, taking a cue from Pavlov's studies, made this mechanism of classical stimulus-response conditioning his own and reported all the experiments Pavlov had done on humans. If you want to catch up with the video I dedicated to Watson and his experiments, you can do so by clicking in the link here in the info box. In the meantime, I, with today and the talk about Pavlov, and therefore about the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned response and the unconditioned response, finished. I salute you, thank you for your attention, and see you next time.